In a few moments, a debate. First, a little more about the constitutional amendment behind these refunds. Tabor, the taxpayer's Bill of Rights.
Tabor has shaped decades of political fortunes and history in Colorado since voters passed it back in 1992.
This is Rachel Estabrook. She is CPR's news director. A couple of years ago, she and two of our colleagues produced an award-winning podcast called The Tax Man, a deep dive into the story of Tabor.
Most people know Tabor as this thing that lets you vote on any tax increase that happens in Colorado at any level. But it's so much bigger and more complicated than that. And Prop CC deals with just a little part of it. Tabor supporters will tell you that it's saved Colorado from the financial problems that Illinois or California or some more liberal states have experienced. Whereas opponents of Tabor will tell you that it's held back Colorado in terms of funding for schools, for higher education, for roads. And in the good years, Colorado should be investing in all those things, but Tabor doesn't allow it.
We're joined by Rachel and the other reporters on the project, Nathaniel Miner and Ben Marcus. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Hey, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, once again, the debate is coming up, but we want a good framing for what people are about to vote on.
You said in your intro, you get these rebates in the mail, like a little check, like it's Publishers Clearinghouse, and you get this, you get cash from the government. Just like everything with Tabor, it's far more complex than that. There are mechanisms built into the law to get that money back to you in ways that you may not even see.
In your taxes, not necessarily a check in the mail.
That's right. And there isn't always enough money to actually give back to taxpayers. So it's actually pretty rare that there's enough money to prompt refunds at all.
But this is not the first time voters statewide have been asked to forego refunds.
Yeah, 15 years ago, around 2005, there was a 5-year timeout that voters approved. This is similar to that, but it would be permanent. This mechanism that the state is using to ask people to give up their refunds, we've seen those across the state at city levels, county, school district, your water board. They've been happening there for 20 plus years. But what's happening here is the state doing it. The implications here are far bigger than what we've seen elsewhere.
Well, those are the stakes. Why don't we tune into the debate, and then I'll have you guys back afterwards.
Looking forward to it.
Popcorn?
No, Ben.
All right, sorry.
Okay, so in support of Prop CC, Democratic Speaker of the Colorado House, Casey Becker, she basically wrote the measure and then the legislature referred it to voters. Against Michael Fields, head of Colorado Rising Action, whose mission is to advance conservative principles. Becker argues that spending your Tabor refund on transportation, K-12 schools, and college will make this state more prosperous.
Colorado's underinvesting in those three areas right now. Colorado's economy and population are booming, and that means more taxes generated for the state of Colorado, but the state isn't allowed to keep and use that money. So if we can keep the revenue we're already collecting in taxes and put it into our schools, help kids attending college, and then if we can put more money into our roads, I do think it'll create a more prosperous Colorado.
You see those as investments that yield more than if people kept that money themselves?
Right now, we are 48th in the country in terms of transportation funding. We're 48th in the country per resident investment in higher ed, and somewhere between 40th and 45th in the country in terms of investment in K-12. You have to actually invest back in your state.
Before we get to Michael Fields with a different view on this, how much money are you asking people to forego?
It changes every year. Really, this will only kick in when Colorado has a booming economy, when we're actually growing faster than inflation.
And of course, the size of that boom determines exactly how much a refund would be. So I realize that this is dependent on economic factors. It's dependent on income. But could you give us a ballpark figure?
Sure. So for the upcoming year, we think that it's going to be about $37 per taxpayer. So not a lot of money. That's, about a cup of coffee a month. But that could yield about $300 million for the state.
There are even rosier forecasts, which would mean the refunds would be bigger. That is the money you'd like to reinvest in the state. Michael Fields, I imagine you don't love sitting in traffic. I imagine you don't hate children. And I imagine you enjoy higher education. Why then would you not want to make these investments as the speaker has laid out?
Sure. I think that we need to make those investments with the current budget that we have. Our budget's $32.5 billion. It was $19 billion 10 years ago. So we're going up by over $1 billion every year. And everybody wants our roads fixed. We want more money to get into the classroom and get to teachers. That's not happening right now. So I think we need to make those adjustments before asking people for their Tabor refunds.
Are you saying that the state ought to live within its means, its current means?
Absolutely. And these means are big means and growing. Since the recession happened in 2008, our state budget growth is second in the country next to North Dakota. And so we are spending more and more each year. What we're not doing is getting these priorities fixed. And so I think this is where we have to have this discussion, and Prop CC lets us have that conversation.
Okay, from 2017 to 2018, Colorado added 80,000 people. Seventh fastest growing state in that time period. Why shouldn't its budget be growing commensurately?
Oh, it is. The Taxpayers' Bill of Rights has a formula that has population plus inflation growth. And so when population comes into Colorado, our budget grows accordingly. And that's what's been happening. The problem is that the legislature won't lock in money for long-term bonding for transportation. They won't ensure that money gets to classrooms instead of administrative costs. And so I think we have to have that conversation across the state and really looking at how big our budget has gotten over the last decade.
Tabor, of course, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, critical to this conversation. It does allow for growth, as you said, Michael, inflation plus population growth. Speaker Becker, I understand you think that's not really a great equation for the growth of government.
That's right. The things the state buys are growing faster than inflation. For instance, healthcare. The state also buys construction materials when we fix roads, for instance. Because we have not increased gas tax, we have not been able to keep up with those costs. So things are costing more, growing faster than inflation. We have not increased a lot of taxes or fees to address those things. State income tax used to be 5%. Now it's 4.63.
There's a lot of fee increases, haven't there?
There are some occasionally. So there were fee increases on transportation in 2009, not enough to cover the costs or the impacts that we have.
Michael Fields, it doesn't seem you're buying this. I see you shaking your head no.
Yeah.
How can there be such a fundamental disagreement over whether Colorado simply has enough money? I mean, presumably the speaker has seen the budget. What is it she's missing?
Well, I think the big growth outside of the Tabor cap that we're talking about. And so, it used to be that 2/3 of the budget fell under this Tabor cap that we're arguing about. Now only 1/3 does, because fees have gone up, because we have enterprises and more money coming in. All that money comes out of our pocket in one way or another. I think the big thing with this is, one, that it's permanent. Right. So the Ref C, which was in 2005, came about, and we had 5 years, and we could look at how that money was spent.
Yeah, just for some background here, Ref C was billed as a kind of Tabor timeout, but it was a short time period, relatively short. This is forever.
This is forever.
Why did you make it that way, Speaker Becker? Why not say, let's do this for a decade and then let Colorado voters decide again?
Prop CC will only have an effect in years that we are above our existing statewide spending cap. We have only had refunds for 8 out of the last 27 years. It's a intermittent thing. It's very temporary in that way. The other thing is that a lot of the other constitutional amendments that have really put us in a so-called fiscal thicket, those are all permanent.
So there are also measures in the state constitution besides Tabor, like Amendment 23, which has to do with education funding, Gallagher, which is a little more complicated. It governs property taxes, and it's resulted in the state having to pick up more for education than it did in the past. You're saying those are all permanent, so this fix needs to be permanent.
That's right. The effect of the Gallagher Amendment is ongoing. It's a permanent effect. It keeps transferring K-12 costs from local governments onto the state. So this is good policy today, and it's going to be good policy ongoing. The other thing is, if voters ever want to go back to the ballot and put in a new spending cap, if they want to run a different formula into the Constitution, they can still do that. Nothing stops that.
It's interesting, Michael Fields, because Tabor is not just about limiting the growth of government. It is fundamentally letting the people have a say over taxation. Mm-hmm. Isn't that precisely what Prop CC is doing? It's asking the people of Colorado to make a change to Tabor. Isn't this precisely what Tabor envisions?
Sure. So two things. One is that I don't disagree that people should vote on it. But the second thing is the ballot language is very misleading. Okay, so the ballot language doesn't say Tabor in it. It doesn't say permanent. It doesn't say refunds. It starts without raising taxes to better fund schools and roads and bridges. I would have liked to see the legislature been more honest with that ballot language and simply said, we want to take your Tabor tax refunds and we want to spend them on education and transportation. Can we have them forever? And that was not what the people are going to see when they open up their ballots.
Speaker, it's interesting. This does not change the tax rate in Colorado, but it does mean that people who would normally get refunds don't get them. When I read that language, I thought, I'm not sure. This is not a tax increase. I'm not sure if that really does paint the whole picture. What do you say?
We are not creating a new tax. We are not increasing a current tax. This is, in fact, money that the state government is already collecting. And our Constitution says, ask voters if you can keep all that money. And that's exactly what we're doing.
You also have built into this an audit. What are you trying to reassure voters about?
We want voters to know that the state will spend the money exactly as specified in the ballot measure, and we will have an independent third party do an audit every year that will be publicly available and publicly posted so that you know exactly a third of any money collected will go to K-12, a third to higher ed, and a third to transportation.
Does that prevent, though, the legislature from moving around other funds from other places and essentially reprioritizing money? In other words, that covers the money that you'd keep if there were Tabor refunds, but there's a lot of maneuvering the legislature can and has done in the past.
So if this ballot measure passes, it becomes law. We can't just move things around. And in fact, the bill language says that this money has to be supplemental. It can't supplant, meaning it can't just take the place of existing funding for our education and transportation.
Michael Fields.
Yeah, well, there's no guarantee where this money is going to go. I think it's a blank check. It's a statute, so they could change the statute at any point.
How is it a blank check if it says it must go to these three areas?
Well, they can change that at any point. Next year, they could come in. They could say, we're taking your Tabor tax refunds forever. It's supposed to go to these things. It was what we said. And now we're going to change that and take the money for something else.
We need to clear this up big time here, Speaker. So address Michael Fields' fundamental point. Right now, it's a third, K through 12, higher education, transportation. Could the legislature, if it gets, desperate in poor economic times, or frankly, I just want to say the Denver Post recently reported that kindergarten enrollment has grown faster than expected, contributing to what could be a $100 million shortfall. Could that be an example where some unforeseen expense comes up and you go, you know what, we're going to redistribute these funds?
So if Prop CC passes, it will be in law. And there's absolutely no history, no precedent of the legislature ever undoing what voters have done. So you can't say, go to voters, but voters, even if they go to you, you can't trust it.
Are you saying then it would never be the case that lawmakers could amend what this pays for?
I think it is highly unlikely, but anything that is statute, including any ballot measure that has already passed, can be amended. It can be amended by voters, and it can be amended by the legislature, but it's never happened.
We are debating Proposition CC on the November ballot. It would allow the state to keep refunds that are now returned to you under the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or Tabor. Democratic House Speaker Casey Becker supports Prop CC. Michael Fields leads the opposition group, Colorado Rising Action. Okay, when we come back, I'll ask Speaker Becker if this is a first step in a larger move to dismantle Tabor. This is Colorado Matters from CPR News.
Support for Colorado Public Radio comes from Citywide Banks, offering business and personal banking solutions at 23 locations across Colorado and at citywidebanks.com. Equal housing lending, member FDIC.
Support comes from Every Child Pediatrics, providing comprehensive health care to 24,000 Colorado children a year, including those who don't have health insurance. Believing that every child deserves access to quality health care. everychildpediatrics.org.
I love contributing to Colorado Public Radio because of the value that it brings to my life.
Supporting CPR is important to me because it's really the only thing I listen to. So I was happy to be able to do it, and I'm happy to continue to listen to CPR.
I would encourage others that have thought about it. It definitely feels good to have donated. You're such a wonderful source of enlightenment and just pure joy of listening.
Join the community of support at CPR.org.
It's Colorado Matters from CPR News. I'm Ryan Warner. Let's get back to our debate over Prop CC on your ballot. It would allow the state to keep refunds that you'd otherwise receive under the constitutional amendment known as TABOR. Speaker Becker, is this the first in a series of steps to dismantle the taxpayer's Bill of Rights, which in Democratic circles is not quite as popular as it is on the conservative side?
I doubt that you will ever see the legislature try to fully dismantle the taxpayer Bill of Rights. This does not even begin that process. TABOR says go to voters, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Now,
this
we
is
should
not
say
any
that
different.
the political landscape here, though, is that there is talk of repealing TABOR altogether through a ballot measure, possibly in 2020. You don't see this as at all connected.
It was not at all connected when we introduced this, and I don't think it's relevant to this conversation. This conversation is, should Colorado be using the tax dollars it already has to be investing? In fact, cities, counties, school boards, special districts across the state have already done this with voters.
Michael, respond to that point, which is that many communities across Colorado have made this determination for themselves. Why shouldn't this state?
Tax increases are actually more successful on the local level because people trust their local officials. They can go and talk to them. It might be city council or it might be county commissioners.
And history in Colorado is littered with statewide tax increases that have not passed.
Sure. On that state level, the last 6 haven't passed besides marijuana. But if you look across, the ones that pass are local, specific, and they're sunset. And this is none of those things. I think when you look at it, this is definitely a first step towards repealing the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. All you have to do is listen to the supporters, the representatives from the campaign Yes on CC. They said this is a rehearsal to future efforts. There was a Colorado Sun article that outlined all this. Dan Ritchie, who gave $400,000 and talked about this, said this is a first step. I think there's no doubt that they want to go after the complete Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and they want to make sure that voters can't weigh in on tax increases.
We've been saying that this is a good first step in addressing some of the funding challenges that Colorado has. No one on the campaign is saying that this is the first step to dismantling TABOR. It's just not what we're talking about. It's not what we are planning to do. I have no idea if others are going to work on that. The public is allowed to have any conversation about anything that they want to. And there are people in Colorado who think TABOR has not been good for the state. That's not the conversation we're having here. We are talking about how a booming Colorado is still leaving our state 48th in the country in higher ed, bottom of the country in terms of transportation and K-12 funding. That's not what prosperous states do.
I was at a debate with Scott Wasserman, who is the head of the Bell Policy Center, and he said, representing Yes on CC, this was a first step to future efforts of raising taxes. He said we need to create more revenue for the government, and that's what we need to do. And so I think it's disingenuous to say people that are representing Yes on CC are not saying this out loud.
I can say unequivocally that this effort was not part of a future effort. That is not why I put it on the ballot. It is unequivocally untrue. If folks want to do that,
and let me just remind people, you are the
to.
author of Prop CC.
I wrote this because I think Colorado has an immediate need to address these things. That's why we did it.
Speaker, in some ways, I hear you talking about the refunds and saying, they don't happen every year. It's not a guarantee. In a way that kind of minimizes how much money this sounds like. On the other hand, you're saying this is going to be, Shangri-La for transportation and education. Which is it?
Again, I don't think this is going to solve everything, but I think it's going to help make a difference. And we can make a difference without raising taxes, without proposing a new tax. We do not want to be the bottom of the barrel. Those impacts are going to multiply the longer this goes on. If we can make an inroad, I think that's a pretty good place to start. One thing that Michael likes to say is, but a lot of money's coming into the state. There is money coming into the state because Colorado has an aging baby boomer population and Medicaid dollars are flowing in. We want those Medicaid dollars to support our senior citizens. We cannot and will not divert Medicaid dollars to fund our roads. That's not how it works. We don't have that option now.
I want to be clear about what the projections look like. And the governor also puts out projections. The governor's economic office puts them out and has a 3-year projection that will be $1.7 billion.
This is the rosiest of the forecasts.
This is the rosiest, but that would mean over the next 3 years for individuals, $248. We don't know how much that could mean to somebody who's trying to pay a bill or do something else. I think that the conversation has to be, what are we doing with that current budget, right? And then a conversation after that, if people think that they're prioritizing it enough, do we need more?
Thanks to both of you for being with us.
It's good to be on.
Thank you for having us.
Michael Fields of Colorado Rising Action, which opposes Prop CC to lift state spending caps in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. Casey Becker is Speaker of the State House and supports CC. Okay, more perspective now from the team behind CPR's podcast, The Tax Man, Rachel Estabrook, Nathaniel Miner, and Ben Marcus. Ben, what stood out for you?
Well, we're here because of reasons that are kind of outside of Colorado's control. So the reason that we are over this revenue cap and refunds are now triggered is because of federal tax reform that Donald Trump put into law with help from Republicans. That added hundreds of millions of dollars to the state budget, getting us that much closer to the cap. And so that's one of the big arguments against Tabor and some of these other things that are in the Colorado Constitution is things change outside the borders of Colorado that we have no control over, whether it's a recession, whether it's federal changes to law, and the state lacks flexibility to deal with those things.
Right. And as we had said before, it's pretty rare Colorado reaches this point where it's taking in enough tax money to have to give a refund. And so I found it really interesting, the line that Casey Becker, that the speaker, is trying to make in this debate. She's trying to walk this line where she's saying, we don't even know if there'll be refunds in future years. You know, this might not even come up, but we need your refund money so bad that we want you to give us a blanket approval to use it for years to come.
Casey Becker is, she wrote the thing. She is the Democratic House Speaker. If you look at the last time there was a big campaign to change something about Tabor 15 years ago with Referendum C, that was really a bipartisan effort. You had the Republican Governor, Bill Owens. He was out there leading the charge. And this time around, at least at the State House, it's really just Democrats with maybe one or two exceptions. Whether that matters, we'll find out in a few weeks.
Thanks to the three of you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.